I'm Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center. A few years ago, learning about the forgotten meaning of the pursuit of happiness changed my life. When the founders wrote that famous phrase in the Declaration of Independence, they meant an ongoing commitment to self-improvement and lifelong learning. This discovery inspired me to write a book, and in my new podcast, I explore the founders' lives with the historians who know them best. Plus, filmmaker Ken Burns shares his daily practice of self-reflection. Join me for Pursuit, the Founder's Guide to Happiness.
Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 21 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Each week, we sit down with an historian to discuss their unique insights into our early American past so we can learn more about who we are and how we can affect a better future. Today, we have a real treat. Today's episode is kind of like a two-for-one deal. I spoke with my good friend and colleague, Dr. Eugene Tesdahl, an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. Gene not only studies the very interesting history of smuggling in colonial North America, but he also participates in living history as an historical reenactor. As a result, today's episode really has two parts. The first half of our conversation focuses on smuggling in colonial North America. Specifically, we discussed the notorious Albany-Montreal fur trade, which took place between about 1700 and 1754. And the second half of our conversation explores the world of living history or historical reenactment. During the first part of our chat, Gene reveals how the 18th century governments of Great Britain and France defined smuggling and why colonial North Americans opted to smuggle goods between New France and British North America, what types of goods the Albany traders exchanged with the French fur traders for peltry, and the role Native American and Euro-American women played in the illegal Albany-Montreal smuggling trade. Now, during the second part of our exchange, Gene will help us dive deeper into the everyday lives of the French colonists in New France by discussing his participation in living history and how historical reenacting helps him better understand and convey early American history. Now, I hope you'll stay tuned to the end of this episode, because Gene was also kind enough to recommend 9 or 10 books about the French and Indian War period so we can further our knowledge. I will tell you where you can find that list after our conversation with Dr. Eugene Tesdahl.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Eugene Tesdahl is an assistant professor of history at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville. He specializes in the history of French, British, and Native American empires in early North America. When not teaching or revising his dissertation, The Price of Empire, Smuggling Between New York and New France, 1700 to 1754, into a book manuscript, Gene participates in first-person historical interpretation or living history of the French and Indian War era. Gene often portrays the composite character of an unlicensed fur trader or coureur de bois, Henri-François Le Tannier. Gene believes that only by paddling birch bark canoes, snowshoeing, and camping in sub-zero temperatures with only wool, linen, leather, and fur clothing to protect him can he gain valuable insight into the period and people he studies. Gene, welcome to Ben Franklin's World.
Thank you, Liz. I'm happy to be here.
Gene, we've known each other for a while. I was thinking before the show, when did we meet? 2007? 2008? I don't think it was
Must have been 2008, I believe, in the Clements Library Archives in scenic Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Yeah, I was on fellowship there researching my dissertation, and I'd been going through the Thomas Gage papers all day, and this tall, nice fellow came up and he says, "Hey, do you want to grab a pizza and a beer?" And that was just what I needed at the end of a day of looking at manuscripts all day.
Me too, and I was looking at manuscripts regarding the illicit fur trade in the Great Lakes, and both of us, I think, found a lot of what we needed there at the Clements.
Yeah, the Clements Library at the University of Michigan is an awesome place to research early American history if you ever have the chance.
It is.
So, Gene, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and how you found your passion for early American history?
Sure. Well, one phrase that really resonates with me, Bernard Balin, a noted historian, said a few years ago in an interview, quote, "But in any case, you don't have to be brought up on a pig farm to write, as Virginia Anderson, who grew up in a Connecticut city, is now doing about pigs and cattle in the 17th century. One can write with great acuity about things one has not personally experienced," end quote. And I start with that quote. It has resonated with me over the years because I, as you know, am the son of an Iowa hog farmer. And as you said in my intro, I don't write about hogs. I write about French, British, and native nations in the 17th and 18th centuries. And even my family, we are not descended of 17th and 18th century immigrants to North America. We're more recent arrivals. And yet I've been fascinated by this period since a very young age because this is an interesting time when the Atlantic world brings Native Americans, Africans, and Europeans together, not just in conflict, but often in compromise. And those ways are really exciting to see unfold.
So what brought you to the infamous, and I've read the records, it was infamous, Albany-Montreal fur trade between 1700 and 1754?
Sure. Well, as is so often the case in historical research or other research, we begin with a research question, and while we are pursuing the answer to that, we run into other things that seem more interesting or seem more confusing. So when I was researching mariage à la façon du pays, now many years ago, which is intermarriage between French men and native women, I found that there were all these footnotes and then often primary document references to le traite illégal or the contraband trade or the Albany trade or the Montreal trade in especially the early 18th century. And this fascinated me. Often there would be similar brief mentions of the trade. So as you said, it was infamous, and yet sometimes it would not provide depth or complexity to what certainly had both depth and complexity. So like several other historians lately, among them Keesyan Waterman and Jan Noel, I decided to probe into this story further, and it has kept me busy.
So let's explore this trade a little bit. So as you know, Albany is really established in 1614 when the Dutch established Fort Nassau, or if you live in New York today, Fort Nassau, as a Dutch fur trading outpost. They're there to trade with Native Americans to get peltry. And over time, that outpost grows into the village of Beversvik, later Albany after 1664. And they're already in the business of the fur trade. So why does this outpost, beginning in 1700, really have to look to Montreal and the citizens of New France to get their furs?
Sure, this is a complex question. The first thing, let's define smuggling. So smuggling is trade outside a set of rules, and usually those rules are wrapped around a European nation state or some sort of controlling body. Contrary to what we might think today, those rules are not always aimed to restrict dangerous or immoral materials like weapons or tobacco or firearms. Oftentimes, especially in the colonial period of North America, they were aimed to protect the interest of the colonizing nation. This was mercantilism at its best. Colonies were designed to supply raw materials and markets for the mother country, and this then would leave most of the manufacturing and the profits back in Europe. In the case of the Albany-Montreal trade of the early 18th century, this would then most directly profit England and France and the metropoles thereof. So it did not take long for many enterprising individuals in the colonies to see that this was not very efficient And as is the case today, where there is inefficiency, there's also often profit. So smugglers, native, French, British, and after 1664, Anglo-Dutch, Dutch-speaking people who were able to essentially acculturate there at Albany, they were able to thwart those distant imperial bureaucrats who were tasked with policing smuggling, and they had a much clearer view of what life was in New France, New York, and what the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois often called Ganienka. And so from time to time, it was deemed that smuggling was either a benefit, and at that time it would not be scrutinized, and at other times it was deemed that smuggling was a liability. So from time to time, there would be acts that were put in place to police this illicit trade and protect the interests of the colonies of New York or New France. Notably on the British side, the Acts of Navigation and Trade in 1651 were meant to do this. They did not always do it, and colonial officials did not always aim to enforce them. And a series of edicts in New France then were aimed to restrict smuggling and trade with outside parties. One of the most famous in this period was an edict issued by Louis XV in 1727.
So, Gene, let's explore the Navigation Acts, because you mentioned that the colonies, the idea behind the colonies is that they're supposed to supply raw materials to the mother country or fatherland. So, England passes these Navigation Acts. Would you tell us how that either facilitates or hinders the colony's ability to send raw materials back to the mother country?
Sure. So for the most part, the Acts of Navigation and Trade since the 17th century and into the 18th century, and these edicts to restrict trade in the French colonies, on paper, they look like they work very well. For the most part, in places like New York, you have, in the 17th century, furs and peltry, you have lumber, you have even commodities like ginseng and maple sugar going back to Europe. New France, you have those items and even some other items as well. And so for the most part, this seems to certainly bolster the manufacturing sector of Europe. It also does a very effective job of hampering the development of a manufacturing sector in New York and New France. And since this is all wrapped up with transatlantic trade, to a certain extent, it's also wrapped up with forms of labor control from indentured servitude to chattel slavery, slavery both of sub-Saharan West Africans and especially in New France of native peoples. It's also wrapped up in the fact that while both Albany and Montreal are linked into these transatlantic trade networks by the early 18th century, that beaver populations, especially in New York, have dropped drastically by the 18th century. And while you have explained how the Dutch had traded for furs well before the English period, some of those Anglo-Dutch families were able to perpetuate this myth of beavers right in the heart of Albany into the 18th century. And so that's part of why this smuggling corridor grew and ultimately came to thrive in the early 18th century.
So the Navigation Acts really require, and the trade edicts from France as well, really require these furs. They're designed to send furs and these other valuable commodities back to the mother country before they start trading them within the colonies. What goods are the smugglers trading amongst each other? We know that the Dutch or the Dutch English are getting furs from the French, but what are the Dutch and Dutch English sending to the French colonists of New France for the furs?
Sure, and that's a good question. So basically, you had the brunt of this illicit trade is actually serving native consumers, particularly of the Haudenosaunee or Iroquois Confederacy, the people of the Longhouse. And many of the people dictating the trade then are, interestingly, not Haudenosaunee men, but often native women. And some of them were doing much of the trading and exchanging themselves. In New France, we even have a cast of both single and married women as well who are doing more of this trade than their English counterparts. Among them, some that I have studied are Marie-Anne, Marie-Madeleine, and Marguerite de Saunier, who were sisters. We also had a prominent widow, Catherine Dagneau, who was also a prominent smuggler, and a figure who at times was in Montreal and at times was in Albany was Geneviève Massé-Lydius, who was quite a prominent figure as well. And so these smugglers on both sides, native, French, Anglo-Dutch, and English, they often wanted some of the same things from furs. They wanted woolens, and particularly woolens, textiles, and finished clothing are, in fact, the highest amount of things that are being traded both legitimately and as contraband in the 18th century at both Albany and Montreal. Where Albany comes in to the picture here is that in the 18th century, English woolens are generally already of a much higher quality than French woolens. And also in the 1720s, there is a bout of bubonic plague that spreads in the south of France in Montpellier, which in fact then is where the woolen industry in France was located. This really decimates French wool production that was already deemed inferior to English wool production. So not only is British wool better, it's also in much higher quantity in the early 18th century. And so there's woolens, there's other tools, and to a certain extent, weapons. There's also brandy, which is being trafficked in this trade, although in comparison to the textiles, all of this is much smaller. The textiles are over 80%. And part of what is fascinating to me then is while many of these goods are going to native consumers, particularly those who are dominating a more robust beaver population in New France, also then you have French and British colonists who are also tapping into this trade as well and are eager to get access to these goods.
One of the aspects of your research that really fascinated me was the fact that the Albany-Montreal trade was conducted and facilitated by so many French and Native American women. Would you tell us about the de Saunier sisters and John Henry Lydius's wife, and how they became involved in the trade and what their roles were?
Sure. And first off is to say that, in fact, while some of the figures who come into best view at this time are some of these French women or French-Canadian women, there were many more, several hundred Haudenosaunee and other Native American women who were very prominent in this trade as well. Sometimes these were mere porters, as they are described at the time, transporting the goods and furs. At other times, they are growing into petit marchands or traders themselves, and sometimes it seems a few of them were able to even get much more successful than that. So it's important to note that while some of these native women do not come into such sharp focus, that in fact their contributions in many ways are much more significant. And many of them, we only have some of their names, like Sauvagesse Agnès or Marie-Madeleine, and the translation on some of these women is simply a descriptor like Marie-Madeleine with one bad eye, whom you know well. But back to the de Saunier sisters and Geneviève Massé-Lydius. So Marie-Anne, Marie-Madeleine, and Marguerite de Saunier were descended of one of the most prominent fur trade families of Montreal. They had quite a charmed life in their upbringing. And interestingly, then in 1725, these young women all in their 20s, are permitted to open a fur trade post at the French Jesuit mission of Sault Ste. Louis, what some bands of Mohawks are already calling Nuganawage by 1725. And this village is on the south bank of the St. Lawrence River, just outside of Montreal. So it was very near where the Desaulniers sisters grew up, and the mission had been there since the late 17th century. It had moved once, and the establishment of Sault Ste. Louis was very significant in the contraband trade, but also in Haudenosaunee life and culture. So in 1725, these Desaulniers sisters were able to establish the post, partially due to the influence of their brother and their father, both known as Pierre Trottier Desaulniers. And on the face of it, it was suggested that this mission was these young, unwed women. It was their opportunity to help the Jesuit priests at Sault Ste. Louis minister to the mostly Mohawk people there at Sault Ste. Louis. But in fact, it's clear by even 1726 that this is a very robust trading post. It also becomes clear by even the late 1720s that the Desaulniers sisters are often having a trade house that's full of textiles, woolens, china, even Delftware that is not coming from Montreal. It's coming 196 miles to the south at Albany on what I have called the Riverine Highway. We also then have Geneviève Massé-Lydius, who she herself is an interesting figure. She was Métis, part French and part Native. We don't know the lineage of her mother exactly, but we know she was Algonquin speaking. Her father then pairs her in a marriage in 1727 with John Henry Lydius, who had all sorts of aliases due to his involvement in smuggling, Johannes Hendrikus, John Henry, John Henricks, and Jean-Henri Lydius. And she herself, though, is involved in this trade, certainly partially due to the connections of her family, not just by this scurrilous Anglo-Dutchman who she happened to marry.
You know, it seems really fascinating to me that you were able to find out so much about the Desaulniers sisters and the Lydiuses as well, because it seems to me that smugglers would they preferred to remain anonymous. Nobody wanted them to know who they were. Otherwise, there were legal ramifications to their acts. So how did you go about tracking these smugglers? And where did you find information about them?
It's difficult. This is not easy. As you say, smugglers, whether the 18th century or the 21st century, do very well to keep their tracks hidden. In some ways, some of these figures remind me a lot of a more recent smuggler, Victor Bout, infamous Russian smuggler who trafficked especially arms, so much so that he was known as the Merchant of Death, and he was caught in 2008 in Bangkok, Thailand, when he's ultimately deemed a threat by the U.S., although he had helped the U.S. years before. This also then is interesting to me because this smuggling in times of peace in the 18th century was trafficking things like furs and cloth, and then during times of war, this would then be trafficking muskets, ammunition, also rope and other wartime stores, along with tactical information. And you see the same things in smuggling corridors in places like Afghanistan today. So, like Victor Bout, Lydius, and the Desaulniers sisters, and Catherine Dagneau were very good at practicing discretion, and yet they have not been impossible to track. Particularly helpful, as with some other scholars, have been some letter books, journals, diaries, and especially court records, because like today, oftentimes where lawbreakers show up is in court records. So I've probed collections in the U.S. and Canada to find the tracks of some of these prominent smugglers, and two particularly interesting documents. The journal, or I should say the letter book of Robert Saunders and his brother John, that was maintained at Albany. John would later mostly be trading at Schenectady, New York. Robert Saunders would keep a very interesting journal or an interesting letter book in the 1750s. In it, he would vary from writing copies of letters in English, Dutch, and French, partially to hide his tracks and knowing that if anyone ever got a hold of letters or especially his letter book, that they may not read all three of those languages. At times, he also is using some terms in Haudenosaunee and especially Mohawk language. And interestingly, he has then ascribed to some of his business contacts code names. So this is really fascinating that in the mid-18th century, some of these smugglers were using code names, and particularly the Saunders, for the most part, are deemed legitimate traders, and yet they're clearly doing some contraband trade, and they're also doing a very good job of hiding their tracks. And so some of the contacts that Saunders protects, and in the process protects himself, some of them are native, and so they are given ideograms, drawings that are like a signature for some of these people, from a smoldering pipe to a partridge. And at other times they're just given the name Monsieur and then a Roman numeral, Monsieur 12, Monsieur 13, and in a couple of cases I was able to crack the code, I believe, particularly then in the case of Monsieur 13. This seems to be John Henry Lydius, and Madame Massé is mentioned in one of those letters. Another document that has been very useful at the National Archives of Canada, and it's also a copy of it is in France, is this journal by Catherine Dagneau, who is also known as the Veuve La Chauvainerie. She herself was a smuggler, and she starts keeping a journal between 1729 and 1731. She gives great accounts of different smugglers. She names names, and she even curiously takes aims at other competing smugglers while protecting herself. She even partially condemns her friends and associates, the Desaulniers sisters, but doesn't name their name, so they remain protected as well.
Well, it sounds like you found a lot of information even when these people didn't keep a lot of information, so good for them for not being too careful. Good for you, I guess I should say.
Right. Good for history.
So how long did the Albany-Montreal trade continue? And did France and England ever try to stop it?
They did. And again, part of this is wrapped up in periods of commerce and periods of tension. As you know, the early 18th century saw really a protracted relationship of enmity between the British and the French, and there would also be one of the largest periods of peace or détente between the British and the French in the early 18th century as well. So the height of this smuggling was between 1701 and 1763. So 1701 is significant, especially from the Haudenosaunee perspective, because this is when the Haudenosaunee, led by their very visionary La Goene, or clan mothers, Council of Clan Mothers, decided in 1701 in two separate treaties to establish neutrality between the British and the French in two separate treaties, which we know as the Grand Settlement. When they did that, when they established neutrality, then in both trade and diplomacy, the Haudenosaunee found themselves very able to play the French and British off each other, both with diplomatic negotiations and in trade. They had some competitor to argue for better terms. And this neutrality then would be largely maintained from 1701 until the opening of the 7 Years' War, which began in 1754, and one could say the Haudenosaunee would then fully side with the British by at least the middle point of that war. And when they did, this was the tipping point that would yield a British victory in the 7 Years' War by 1763. So the smuggling would go on throughout this period, and during times of war, as in Queen Anne's War, from 1702 to 1713, and again in King George's War, 1744 to 1748, I have been very fascinated to see that the smuggling, even trafficking furs and woolens, continues during those wars, but then the smuggling carries on different meanings during wartime. As smuggling systems today change during wartime, you start to see many more wartime stores during especially King George's War, more muskets, more powder, more uniforms and rope and things needed to execute a war. And also you see very important during wartime is both the French and the British recognize that these smugglers, especially these Haudenosaunee women, are giving invaluable tactical information. And the Haudenosaunee recognize this as well, for they too are continuing to weigh the position that they're in, especially when Haudenosaunee neutrality is in effect. The way this smuggling goes on then, during times of war, most British and French officials who are tasked with policing smuggling, they see that during wartime, even when smugglers then have a much higher profile, that they are much more invaluable during periods of war. So it's usually periods immediately following a war, as in 1751, while the Desaulniers sisters had been actively engaged in this trade since 1725, just 3 years after King George's War ended, was when finally the governor of Nouvelle-France, La Jonquière, would push to expel Marianne, Marie-Madeleine, and Marguerite Desaulniers for smuggling. And when he did, just months later, after 1751, they were expelled to La Rochelle. Just months later, these three dynamic entrepreneurs had established a new trading enterprise in La Rochelle, where they would be dealing with commodities from North America, the Caribbean, and Africa.
Gene, I find your research fascinating, and we could talk about it all day, but I'd like to transition and talk about your alter ego, Henri-François Letonnier. Now, you don't just study the French and Indian War period, you actually relive the period. And I don't mean just going to Fortress Louisbourg or Montreal or some of these sites to see the geography. I mean, you dress up as a French and Indian War trader and relive history. So would you tell us about your living history experience and specifically about your alter ego? Who is Henri-François Letonnier and how did you find him?
I have found my passion for living history or first-person interpretation over many years. And some people then who know of living history, they either love it or they might deem it hokey or a strange way to encounter history. I absolutely love it, and I fell in love with it at the age of 9. I was a farm kid, and I had shoveled a lot of manure, and I was good at that, but I hated doing it. And that would all change when my parents took me to Living History Farms in Des Moines, Iowa, to a reproduced 1840s farm. And after I'd spoken with a costumed interpreter for a while, he asked me to help him move some manure with a historic fork. And it would then take my parents over an hour to pull me away from this. So something I hated to do. So this is the power of living history. It takes even the mundane and it makes it both educational and entertaining. And I think it's important to think that first-person historical interpretation, it will never supplant rigorous primary and secondary research, but when it's done well, it can really light passion for students and the public alike. So in 1996, I had already been doing historical reenacting for a while of the French fur trade and the Seven Years' War period, and I decided to create a new persona, Henri-François Letonnier. So, as you noted, this is a composite character. He was not actually a person. As far as I know, no person by this actual name did exist in New France, but what I have sculpted him to be, similar to street theater then, is that he was very common of unlicensed fur traders in the 17th and 18th centuries of New France, known as coureurs de bois. So these unlicensed traders played a very important role in New France, particularly wrapped up in some of these policies to restrict trade within the French Empire. There, at varying periods, were as little as only a few dozen congés or permits for trading for furs in New France, and yet most people who were living in New France were engaged in the fur trade. So you had, at any given time, hundreds of these coureurs du bois, and yet to publicly call someone a coureur du bois could land you in court for libel, even when that person, in fact, might have even been the third generation of unlicensed trader in his family. So I've been giving presentations as Henri-François Letonnier for nearly 2 decades. And in fact, this very week at the University of Wisconsin-Platteville, I delivered a lecture as Letonnier. I listed him as my guest lecturer. My students did not know that it would be me in 18th century dress. I opened by addressing the class in Anishinaabe-Moan, which is an Algonquin dialect largely known as Ojibwe. I then switched to speaking to them in French, and then I finally addressed them in English with a French accent. And so for 35 minutes, I interact with my class as if the year is 1750. They then pose questions to me about material culture and about trade and religion in New France. And then I break character. I take my hat off and I drop the accent. And then we spend the rest of the time discussing the benefits and limitations of first-person historical interpretation as an educational tool.
Well, your students aren't the only people who are interested in your experiences as Henri-François. When I posted to Poor Richard's Club, the private Facebook community for Ben Franklin's World listeners, and to Twitter that I would be interviewing you, many listeners reached out and want to know the answers to their questions. So, for example, listener Michelle would like to know how religious Henri-François is and how French he feels when he lives so far away from France.
Thanks, Michelle. These are good questions. Religion in all of colonial North America is not as clear-cut as some history books would have us believe, and this is especially true in Nouvelle France, where we have such an interdependence between native cultures, mostly Algonquin-speaking cultures, and French culture in New France. And that also then spreads to religion. So Henri, like most actual coureurs du bois by the early 18th century, he then largely sees himself as Catholic. When I dress as Henri, I wear several St. Anne's medals, which are cast-off originals, often from archaeological sites. St. Anne was the patron saint of mothers and sailors, but by the 17th century, she's also then deemed the patron saint of engagés, or French voyageurs, of canoe paddlers. And so it was very common for canoe paddlers and petit marchands or traders like Henri to wear these medals, and particularly to pray to St. Anne when they were on rivers and lakes, which they often were, especially if they were paddling the over 2,000 miles from Montreal to the interior of the western Great Lakes, as I often discuss Henri doing. What's interesting is that many Algonquin-speaking nations, like the Odawa or the Ojibwe or the Potawatomi, are also largely Catholic, or at least baptized by the 18th century, and many of them are wearing St. Anne's medals, and there's even a great depiction of some Huron children in a painting from the late 17th century, where as their canoe is sinking in this painting, they are praying to St. Anne to save them. Henri then also wears a native amulet, which is made of brain-tanned deerskin and is decorated with folded and dyed porcupine quills, known as quill work. And it was then very common for Coureurs du Bois like Henri to also then be very aware of native cosmology, particularly the Algonquin-speaking belief in Monadu, or spirit, that most things, animate or inanimate, would have spirits that would need to be respected, particularly when paddling on, say, La Mer Douce or Lake Superior. The notion and awareness of a creature known as the Gichi Pichu, or the underwater panther, was something that both natives and many, many French Canadians observed and aimed to honor anything they thought would keep them from being capsized.
So Michael would like to know how Henri Francois lives and what he eats.
Thanks, Michael. So Henri, being a Creole, born French heritage, but born in North America, saw himself certainly as an active member of La Nouvelle France. And food, then, is an interesting topic, particularly then whether a Coureur du Bois like Henri, whether he would be at his stone home in Montreal, which he might be during the winter months, or if he is living in the interior, something that was called living en de ruine. So while he was trading, he would be living with Algonquin-speaking and other native peoples, and so eating much more of food common to them. And he would also partially be trading with native people, particularly native women, for food and sometimes clothing, especially moccasins, for himself and also those young engagés or voyageurs who were helping him paddle birch bark canoes loaded with trade goods coming from Montreal or back to Montreal loaded with furs. And so one thing about food, Michael, is that for the most part in the 18th century, roasted meat was very popular by both Canadians and natives. And so roasted meat, particularly wild game, you saw this even in Montreal as well as in Anishinaabe Odena in Ojibwe villages. You'd have duck, venison, beaver, and buffalo. And again, sometimes that would be on plates in Montreal as well. And in Montreal, you would have certainly more beef and pork, even salt pork packed in lard and shoved into barrels. Sometimes this would be taken from Montreal, but again, it would not last long. So when French fur traders were traveling into the interior, into upstate New York and further west into the Great Lakes, you saw them particularly turning to many more native foods, manoman, or wild rice, or mashkigiman, cranberry, usually dried cranberry, and zinzibaquad, maple sugar that you would get in cakes from native peoples. These three foodstuffs, wild rice, cranberry, and maple sugar, sometimes eaten together in a stew called a wapu, which is sometimes bastardized into a term known as rubabu by the late 18th century. Eating stews like this were very common, and also eating a lot of pemmican. Pemmican is pulverized jerk, pulverized dried meat, depending on if you're in the east or the west. It might be dried and pulverized venison or moose closer to Montreal, and when you got closer to, say, modern cities of Duluth, Minnesota, or Thunder Bay, Ontario, this would often have more pulverized, dried bison meat in it. And then it would have a lot of buffalo fat, and then would sometimes have a little sugar in it or some dried cranberry or blueberry in it as well. Another thing that I often eat, Michael, while dressed as Henri, is ship's bread or biscuit. Ship's bread and biscuit or biscuit is essentially an unleavened bread, and as I like to say, it tastes and looks a lot like terracotta bathroom tile, and so you have to soak it in order to eat it. And I know a bit about these foods because often I am eating these actual foods when I am not presenting in classes, but sometimes when I'm even paddling birch bark canoes or snowshoeing out in the woods.
Some of those dishes sound actually very delicious. I'm impressed with Henri Francois's palate. Now, John would like to know what the life expectancy for a coureur de bois like Henri Francois was. And, did the coureurs de bois live a shorter lifespan than those who lived in urban or settled areas?
Thanks, John. Yes, this is a good question, and generally, yes, it seems they lived shorter, though any good historical question, the first answer is it depends. And so particularly those young men who were not actually coureurs de bois, but were just the paddlers of canoes, those French-Canadian voyageurs or engagés, they usually had a much shorter lifespan, like indentured servants or some enslaved people at the time. They were doing very hard manual labor, sometimes paddling canoes 12 or even 16 hours a day. When they ran out of river or lake between Montreal or the interior, they would be portaging canoes and goods and furs, which means to empty your canoe and carry goods, usually in packs weighing about 180 pounds apiece, over the portage or trail, and then you had to move the canoe and continue paddling. So this was very rigorous work, and it's what one of my colleagues, Carl Koster, has called voyageurs the over-the-road truckers of the 18th century, which really deems how much of the culture of New France kind of viewed voyageurs. They did not respect them very much. And like coureurs de bois, then they didn't necessarily mind that their lifespans might have been shorter, but they also recognized that even when the coureurs de bois were essentially, in a way, smuggling or at least breaking the edicts meant to prevent too much trading for furs, they knew that it was part of the economic lifeblood of New France. And so a figure like Henri, he might have died in his 30s, like many engagés did, or he could have lived to his 50s or a bit older, and particularly if he was able to get out of the trade and if not retire, then do more trading from Trois-Rivières or Quebec or Montreal, then that, of course, would be a very different story that might have him enjoying a little more stable life on the stone streets of Montreal.
Now, Jean, this is my question. Henri Francois has been known to paddle birch bark canoes upstream, snowshoe through the woods, and camp in sub-zero temperatures with just period clothing. I would really like to know about these experiences and how they help you better connect with and better understand the 1700 to 1754 period that you study.
Sure, Liz. Full disclosure, though, I have never paddled a birch bark canoe upstream, and I hope never to. But over the past 2 decades, I have logged over 1,000 miles paddling birch bark canoes. And 1 month ago, I was snowshoeing and camping with friends in 18th century fashion near Duluth, Minnesota. One of the nights it was 10 below.
Oh.
And a few years ago, I was in fact camping when it was 30 degrees below zero without wind chill. And that night I knew it was cold because the next morning one of my friends had even developed pleurisy, liquid freezing in his lungs. And so this is what some people say then is perhaps taking history a little too far. One does not want to ever get hurt, but when you do things like this, you get calluses on your hands from paddling for several days, or you get really cold camping in buffalo robes and hand-woven blankets. This might give you a little closer appreciation of what 18th century life was actually like. One thing that I think is important, that while I certainly love doing this, and as I said, for me, first-person historical interpretation, sometimes it's done at historic sites, and sometimes I present it as an educational tool in the classroom or to community groups. But I also often do it with friends who do it as well, and it's not done for the public. And sometimes it's in moments like that where you really learn the most about yourself and possibly some things about the past. 2 years ago, I was on a short 20-mile birch bark canoe trip with 2 friends. We then were eating pemmican out of a dried buffalo container known as a toho. And my friend had shot the buffalo in the pemmican using his flintlock musket. He'd taken it on the Assiniboine Reservation out in the west and made the pemmican himself. So that's just one example that eating traditional foods prepared in a traditional way and eating them over a fire in a traditional fashion then really brings to life a primary document description of doing that exact thing. I also believe it's very important that reenactors or others understand that even as valuable as this might be, offering insight to an earlier period of life, it is impossible to 100% recreate life of the 18th century. And that even with some of the steps that I take, I fully know that I'm a 21st century person and not a coureur de bois of the early 18th century. And I'm really glad to be able to take a shower and to have central heat after I'm done doing these kinds of things.
I'm glad you could take a shower too, because I often feel that I would like to witness certain things of the past, but I really don't want to ever smell it.
Right, and in fact, that's one of the things that we will never, thankfully, be able to know about the true 18th century, especially with Europeans. We know that sometimes they were maybe only thoroughly bathing twice a year. So I'm with you, Liz.
So how does someone get involved in living history? Is there a directory of groups, and how do you select the period you wish to reenact?
Sure, this is a good question. So living history groups are, in fact, all over the world. They are especially popular in North America, and they span many time periods. So there are directories of historical reenactment groups.
And those are good things to think about. Well, Gene, you've been very generous with your time, but before we let you go, we must go to the Time Warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
Are you ready for your Time Warp question, Gene?
I am.
All right. In your opinion, what might have happened if the governors of New York or New France had stopped the Albany-Montreal fur trade before the French and Indian War? What would the impact have been on Native American and colonial societies in New York and New France?
This is a great question. And indeed, at times, perhaps this nearly happened. And it's the role of contingency that makes the consideration of some counterfactuals then very worthwhile. So, for instance, if that edict issued by Louis XV in 1727 had actually completely stopped the flow of goods, furs, and information from New France to New York and vice versa, many things would have been different. In many ways, life and communication between Haudenosaunee, French, British, and Anglo-Dutch people would have almost nearly stopped. That particularly would have been very true by 1745 during King George's War, when New England militias, sailors, and the British Navy took the fortress of Louisbourg, you mentioned earlier, and they held it for 3 years. When they did that, this river and highway that linked Albany to Montreal became not just a minor trickle of trade, but it became the main corridor by which information, wartime stores, and trade and communication happened in eastern North America. So if the smuggling would have stopped, not only would the 7 Years' War have been very different, perhaps it may never have happened.
Wow, that was a global war. So that's interesting to think about if the French and Indian War hadn't happened. But before we conclude, would you tell us what is next for you as a scholar and for Henri Francois as a fur trader and adventurer?
Certainly. So for me as a scholar, I currently have 3 articles under review in peer-reviewed journals. And of course, like most historians, I am constantly working on a book manuscript. My current one is in process, and it is addressing smuggling between New York and New France. I am expanding it from my dissertation so that it will cover the period 1701 until the end of the American Revolution, 1783. And particularly then it will show a big change then from 1701 till after the post 7 Years' War period, when the smuggling was decreasing considerably. As for Henri, he will be appearing occasionally in my classroom as always, and this summer I plan to be on the shores of Lake Superior at Grand Portage National Monument, which is a fine haunt for Henri, although it pushes him out of the purview of the 7 Years' War to the modern era of 1793.
And where is the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Sure. I am easily found at uwplatt.edu, the University of Wisconsin Platteville. And if you go to that website and search my name, Eugene Tesdall, you will find my faculty bio there under the History Department's webpage.
And you won't even have to search for it because we'll include a link to it in the show notes page. Well, Gene, thank you so much for joining us today on Ben Franklin's World. I really enjoyed our conversation.
As did I. Thank you, Liz.
Smugglers often fly under the radar of society. They just don't want people to know what they're up to. And yet, amazingly enough, several early American smugglers left a paper trail behind that scholars like Gene Tesdall have used to uncover interesting and exciting details about this illegal early American world, such as the fact that women conducted most of the smuggling along the Albany-Montreal trade. I'm also grateful that Gene shared his insight into living history with us, because I don't know about you, but I have often thought about what it would be like to have lived in colonial, revolutionary, and early Republic America. And it seems like historical reenacting provides a good, approximate way to gain even further insight in what it would have been like to live as an early American person. You can find information about Gene, his research, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, which you'll find at benfranklinsworld.com/021. Also included in this week's show notes are Jean's recommended reading list for the French and Indian War period. There are 9 or 10 books listed there that you may want to check out, especially if you're interested in furthering your knowledge of the period. If you would like to submit your questions for an upcoming guest historian, you should join Poor Richard's Club, our private social community for Ben Franklin's World listeners hosted on Facebook. To join, visit benfranklinsworld.com and sign up for the Franklin Gazette, a weekly newsletter that contains the show notes for each episode, as well as a link to join Poor Richard's Club. To ensure that you never miss an episode of Ben Franklin's World, you should subscribe. You can now subscribe to Ben Franklin's World via iTunes, Stitcher, Spreaker, Agogo, TuneIn Radio, and now iHeartRadio. There are a lot of options there, so you can check them all out by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/subscribe. And finally, if you were thinking about participating, or if you do participate in living history, I would love to know what period you would like to reenact. Please share your answers with me via liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweet me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.